It was late summer in 2015 when my aunt suggested we go camping. She'd always been the adventurous type, a stark contrast to her small, delicate frame. At 70 years old, she moved with the energy of someone in their early 50s, determined and quick-witted. Growing up in the Ozark Highlands, she had spent much of her youth exploring the wilderness. For her, the forest was as familiar as home. I was 28 at the time, and though I didn't share her enthusiasm for nature, I couldn't say no. I had recently moved back to Arkansas after struggling to make ends meet in the city, and spending time with her seemed like a good way to reset. She picked a location she claimed to know inside out, a secluded area near the Ouachita Mountains, far from any marked trails or popular campsites. "It's so peaceful out there," she said while we were planning. "No crowds, no commotion, just the woods." We packed up her trusty old station wagon with everything we'd need. A sturdy tent, a portable stove, and enough provisions for a few days. I brought my notebook and a camera, hoping to find some creative inspiration. The drive was long, winding through narrow, tree-lined roads. By the time we reached her chosen spot, the sun was high, and the forest was alive with the chatter of birds, the rustle of leaves, and the hum of insects. We parked on an overgrown gravel road and hiked about a mile into the woods, finding a small clearing beside a bubbling stream. It was idyllic, like something out of a travel magazine. The water glimmered under the midday sun, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. "Perfect," my aunt said, setting down her pack. That first afternoon was spent setting up camp. Despite my protests, she insisted on doing most of the heavy lifting. We had the tent pitched and firewood gathered in no time. By evening, we were sitting around the fire, eating canned stew and sipping hot tea from enamel mugs. As the sun disappeared, the forest seemed to transform. The cheerful chirping of birds and buzzing of insects faded, replaced by an almost oppressive silence. The darkness was unlike anything I'd ever experienced before, dense and all-encompassing. The stars were brilliant, but they only seemed to illuminate the tops of the trees. That night, I barely slept. The stillness of the woods heightened every sound: twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Small, ordinary noises became unsettling in the isolation. By morning, my aunt was already up, boiling water for coffee. She looked refreshed, unbothered by the eerie night. Meanwhile, I felt like I hadn't closed my eyes at all. We spent the day exploring. She showed me an old game trail she remembered from her childhood and identified plants her own mother had taught her about. Her energy was infectious, and for a while, I forgot the unease of the previous night. As the day wore on, I began noticing odd things. Near the stream, we found a neat stack of rocks, balanced in a way that didn't seem natural. My aunt shrugged it off. "Probably some other camper," she said. Later, deeper in the woods, I noticed claw-like marks gouged into a tree trunk. They were deep and jagged, far higher than any animal I could name. "Maybe a bear," my aunt suggested, though her tone wasn't as confident as usual. That evening, the tension returned. We ate in near silence, stealing glances at the darkening forest. The fire felt like a fragile shield against the vast, looming night. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a strange noise outside the tent. It was rhythmic, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. My breath caught. The sound was close, too close. I reached out to wake my aunt, but she was already alert, her hand gripping my arm. She pressed a finger to her lips, silently urging me to stay still. The sound grew louder, then abruptly stopped. We sat frozen, listening. My heart raced so loudly I was certain it could be heard outside the tent. After a long stretch of silence, my aunt whispered, "Stay here," and slipped outside. I wanted to stop her, but I couldn't move. I sat there, clutching my blanket as the minutes dragged on. The glow of the campfire cast flickering shadows on the tent walls, amplifying my fear. When she returned, her face was pale and she looked years older. "There's nothing out there," she said, but her voice wavered. The next morning, we decided to cut the trip short. Packing up felt slow and tense, and every little noise made us pause. As we hiked back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone, but the forest seemed empty. When we reached the car, relief washed over me. We loaded up quickly and started down the dirt road. Suddenly, my aunt slammed on the brakes. In the middle of the road ahead was another stack of rocks, identical to the one we'd seen near the stream. Neither of us spoke. She reversed the car, turned around, and drove a much longer route back to town. We never talked about that trip again, but I know we both felt it. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something natural, and it wasn't something human. I was 31 when it happened. My dog, Max, and I had spent a lot of time camping in remote areas that year. It was 2015, and I had recently relocated to a small town in Arizona for a new job. On my days off, I'd gather my gear, load Max into my old SUV, and head out to explore the endless stretches of desert. I loved the quiet, just me, my dog, and the vast dry land stretching under a massive sky. One weekend in early November, I decided to check out a place I'd stumbled across on a hiking forum. It wasn't an official campsite, just an old mining site tucked deep into the hills. The directions were vague, and it was a 2-hour drive from town, but I enjoyed the sense of adventure. Max loved it too. He was a mix, mostly Labrador, with a boundless energy that matched my own. We set out early on Saturday morning, hoping to reach the spot by midday. The dirt road leading there was rough, and I had to stop several times to clear fallen branches from the trail. Max sat in the passenger seat, watching me through the windshield with his ears perked, like he was standing guard. When we finally arrived, the mining site wasn't much to look at. Just a few crumbling buildings, piles of rubble, and the dark opening of a mine shaft dug into the hillside. The dry air smelled of sagebrush and dust, and it felt like we were the only living beings for miles. I set up camp close to my vehicle, near enough to the mine for a look, but far enough away to avoid any mishaps in the dark. After pitching my tent and unloading my supplies, I grabbed a flashlight and decided to check out the mine. Max stayed at my heels, wagging his tail. The entrance was arched and supported by old, weathered beams that looked like they'd collapse at the slightest touch. I shined my flashlight inside but could only see a few feet into the darkness. The cool air carried a faint metallic tang. "Let's check it out, Max," I said, mostly to myself, stepping cautiously inside. The first few yards were uneventful, just loose dirt and scattered stones. The shaft was wider than I'd expected, and the ceiling high enough to keep me from feeling trapped. As we moved deeper, the light from the entrance dimmed, replaced by the narrow beam of my flashlight. Max seemed uneasy, his ears twitching at every small sound. At one point, he froze and let out a low growl. I stopped in my tracks, a shiver running down my spine. I strained to hear what he had noticed, but there was nothing, just the faint drip of water somewhere farther in. I chalked it up to his sharp instincts and decided we'd gone far enough. On the way back, I noticed something odd: scratches on the mine walls. They weren't random. They seemed deliberate, forming patterns that I couldn't make sense of. Shaking off the unease, I returned to camp with Max close at my side. The rest of the afternoon was calm. I cooked a simple dinner over a small fire while Max lay nearby, his gaze fixed on the horizon. As the sun dipped below the hills, the desert changed. The day's warmth vanished, replaced by a biting chill. The sky darkened to a deep blue, and stars shone with a brilliance that seemed unreal. I crawled into my tent around 9 p.m., Max curling up at my feet. The night was silent, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the brush. I woke in the middle of the night to Max growling, a low, guttural sound unlike his usual grumbles. My heart raced as I fumbled for the flashlight. "What is it, Max?" I whispered, shining the light around the tent. The zipper was still shut, and everything looked as it should, but Max wouldn't stop growling. He stared intently at one corner of the tent, his body tense. I unzipped the tent cautiously and stepped outside. The cold air stung my face as I scanned the campsite with my flashlight. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. Beyond that, there was only darkness. The mine entrance loomed nearby, a black void in the hillside. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, something shifting in the shadows, but when I looked closer, there was nothing. I retreated to the tent, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. Max, however, stayed on edge, his growls turning to soft whines. The next morning, I decided to leave early. Something about the place didn't sit right. While packing up, I noticed tracks in the dirt near the mine entrance. They weren't animal tracks, and they weren't mine. They were wide, deep impressions, as if someone had walked barefoot. The tracks led from the mine to my tent and back again. A chill ran through me. I didn't wait to figure out who or what had made them. I loaded Max and my gear into the SUV and left as fast as I could. I never returned to that spot, and I don't talk about it much, but sometimes late at night I think about those tracks, how they came so close to where I'd been sleeping and how whatever it was had been watching us the whole time. The rain began to fall as the last rays of sunlight vanished beyond the horizon. It was supposed to be a calm night. I was a forest ranger assigned to a secluded campsite nestled deep in the Cerridon woods of northern Pennsylvania. The year was 2021, and I had been on the job for a few years. My duties usually included patrolling the grounds, checking on campers, and ensuring wildlife didn't venture too close. That night, however, my biggest concern seemed to be the worsening weather, at least at first. I was 34 then and not entirely new to working overnight shifts, though the solitude of this specific post always put me on edge. The campground stretched over several miles, with only a few designated camping areas. It wasn't peak season, so just 3 groups of campers had signed in. I planned to check on them all before settling in for the night at the ranger station, a modest cabin on the edge of a clearing about 3 miles from the nearest campsite. As the rain intensified, I grabbed my waterproof jacket, flashlight, and keys to the ranger vehicle. The narrow dirt trail leading through the forest was now a slick, muddy path. Trees loomed overhead, their branches thrashing in the wind. The truck's headlights barely pierced the downpour, and the rhythmic patter of rain on the roof was relentless. The first campsite was empty when I arrived. The registry showed that a couple had reserved it, but it seemed they had packed up and left ahead of the storm. I radioed the report back to base and moved on to the second site. At the second spot, a group of college students had gathered around a tarp-covered fire pit. They waved when I drove by, and everything seemed in order. I made a mental note to check on them again later if the weather worsened. The third site was the furthest from the station, about 5 miles out, and had been booked by a lone camper, a man named Eric, in his mid-40s. When I pulled up, his tent was still there, but there was no sign of him outside. I assumed he was staying dry inside and decided not to disturb him. I logged my observations and turned back toward the ranger station. That's when things began to feel strange. About halfway back, I spotted something on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a fallen tree branch, but as I approached, I saw it was a backpack, soaked through and half buried in mud. I stopped the truck and stepped out into the rain, flashlight in hand, to inspect it. The pack was nearly empty, containing only a few water bottles and some granola bars. No ID, no phone, nothing to identify its owner. I tried radioing this in, but the storm interfered, and static drowned out my message. With no other options, I decided to bring the backpack back to the station to report it from there. By the time I returned, I was drenched, and the rain had become torrential. I hung my jacket, placed the pack on the table, and tried the radio again. This time, the signal was clearer. I reported the abandoned item and asked if any calls about missing campers had come in. The dispatcher confirmed no such reports but promised to alert the main office. I made a cup of coffee and reviewed the logbook while the storm howled outside. I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. The backpack didn't match anything belonging to the registered campers, and its presence on the roadside made no sense. Around midnight, I decided to check the security cameras. The station system was basic, with a few motion-triggered cameras positioned around the campground. Most of the feeds showed nothing but rain and swaying trees. But when I switched to the camera overlooking the third campsite, I froze. Through the grainy feed, I could make out Eric's tent. What drew my attention, though, was the movement outside it. A figure was crouching low, circling the tent with jerky, unnatural movements. The rain distorted the image, but I could tell something wasn't right. Grabbing my flashlight and radio, I headed back out into the storm. I tried to convince myself it was Eric, possibly disoriented or injured, but as I neared the site, unease gripped me tighter. When I arrived, the tent had collapsed, and Eric was nowhere to be seen. I called out, but the wind carried my voice away. I scanned the area with my flashlight and found footprints in the mud. Too many for one person. Some of them were fresh and led into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed. The footprints led deeper into the forest, and the rain made visibility worse. I paused when my flashlight caught a glint in the mud. A knife, oddly clean despite the rain. My heart raced as I picked it up. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound coming from the trees. I stood frozen, flashlight shaking in my hand. The sound grew louder, more deliberate, and distinctly human. I backed away, my boots slipping in the mud. The beam of my light caught a figure between the trees, tall, thin, and watching me. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze pierce through the darkness. I turned and ran, the forest closing in as branches clawed at my jacket. Footsteps followed, uneven and fast, matching the strange movements I had seen on the camera. Reaching the truck, I leapt inside and slammed the door shut. I locked it and sped back toward the station. In my rearview mirror, I thought I saw the figure standing at the tree line, but when I blinked, it was gone. Back at the station, I locked every door and window and waited for dawn, unable to shake the feeling I was being watched. When daylight finally came, I radioed for a search team. They combed the area but found no trace of Eric or the figure. Only the knife remained, logged as evidence but unconnected to any case. I still work as a ranger, though I avoid that part of the woods whenever possible. On stormy nights, I can't help but glance into the shadows, half expecting to see that figure watching again. In the summer of 1981, my high school organized a week-long hiking trip in the Rocky Mountains. I was 18 and thrilled. This was my first real adventure into the wilderness. The plan was straightforward: follow a popular loop trail through the mountains while carrying everything we needed: tents, sleeping bags, clothes, food, and cooking supplies. Our group consisted of 11 students and 2 teachers leading the way. The trail was said to be stunning, with towering pine trees and crisp, clean air. Streams and lakes wove through the landscape like silver threads, adding to the serene beauty. But nature also held its dangers. We were warned about bears, dehydration, and the risk of getting lost. Supposedly, we'd be trailing a group of horseback campers by a day or two, which at first sounded reassuring. Their presence might make the trail feel less isolated. By the third day, though, their impact was anything but comforting. Every campsite we reached was a disaster. The riders had left trash scattered everywhere, failed to dig proper latrines, and tossed fish remains carelessly near water sources. It wasn't just irritating, it was dangerous. Food scraps and garbage attracted animals, especially bears. It felt like they didn't care about the people who'd come after them. That night, as I sat by the campfire, unease crept in. A single hungry bear could turn this trip into a nightmare. I barely slept, every sound in the dark forest sharpening my nerves. The fourth day brought the worst campsite yet. The horseback campers hadn't properly extinguished their fire. What looked like a harmless pile of ashes had reignited into a smoldering ground fire. The dry pine needles and decomposed vegetation on the forest floor fed the slow-burning flames. We dropped our packs immediately. The teachers shouted instructions, but I didn't wait. I grabbed my water bottle and sprinted to the creek to fill it. Everyone did the same, rushing to pour water on the spreading fire. It was a chaotic scene. The fire wasn't raging, but it was alive, creeping steadily through the dry forest floor. My heart pounded as I splashed water over the glowing embers. The steam hissed angrily, as if the fire itself was resisting us. I was so focused on the fire that I didn't see the bear until someone screamed. I looked up to see a large black bear near our campsite, sniffing around. My stomach dropped as I realized it had its eyes on my backpack, lying just a few feet away. Before I could react, the bear grabbed the pack in its jaws and bolted into the trees. My instincts screamed to let it go. It was just a bag, but that bag held my food for the entire trip. Without it, I'd be in serious trouble. Against every ounce of common sense, I ran after the bear. The forest seemed to close in around me as I chased it, branches slapping my face and arms. The bear was quick, but the weight of my pack slowed it down. I had no plan for what to do if I caught up. It was pure desperation driving me forward. The bear tried to squeeze between two trees, but the pack snagged on the trunks. It hesitated, confused, and then let go, darting deeper into the woods. I grabbed the pack and ran back to the campsite without stopping, my lungs burning and my heart racing. When I returned, the others had managed to extinguish the fire. My pack, however, was in bad shape. The frame was bent, and one of the large pockets was torn open. My food was gone, eaten by the bear or lost in the chase. Granola bars, sandwiches, and trail mix, all of it was missing. For the rest of the trip, I had to depend on my friends for food. Every bite came with a side of guilt. The trip wasn't ruined, but it left its mark. Each evening, I triple-checked everything, hanging food high in the trees, cleaning up every crumb of trash, and ensuring the fire was completely out. When we returned home, I felt changed. The mountains were breathtaking, but they didn't care about us or our plans. Out there, we were just visitors. That bear taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Nature has its own rules. Forgetting them, even briefly, can have serious consequences. To this day, I can't go camping without thinking about that trip, about the bear moving silently through the trees, and the way it grabbed my pack like it belonged to the wild. The wilderness isn't something to tame, it's something to respect. It was early November last year when my girlfriend Clara and I decided to go on a camping trip with our buddy Jason. The autumn leaves were at their peak, and the crisp chill of winter was beginning to creep into the air. We chose a secluded spot in the Durand forest. The campground was tiny and barely noted on the map, but we liked the idea of avoiding the usual crowded trails. The plan was to spend the weekend unwinding, enjoying nature, and soaking in the wilderness before the first frost arrived. We reached the campsite late on a Friday afternoon. The drive there was peaceful, miles of winding dirt roads flanked by towering pines and maples dressed in fiery shades of red and orange. By the time we pulled in, the sun hung low, casting long shadows across the ground. The campground was almost deserted. Only 2 other groups were there, both camped far from our chosen spot near the edge of the woods. We pitched our tents, a larger one for Clara and me and a smaller one for Jason. Once the tents were up, we started a fire and settled in. The new moon meant the night would be dark, and as the sun set, the shadows deepened quickly. After dinner, we sat by the fire, listening to the comforting crackle of wood and the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No crickets chirping or distant animal calls, just the 3 of us huddled in a cocoon of firelight, surrounded by the vast blackness of the woods. Around 9:30, I volunteered to take the trash to the dumpster at the campground entrance. It wasn't far, just a short 5-minute walk down a dirt path, lit only by the beam of my flashlight. The light cut through the dark, catching glimpses of tree trunks, bushes, and the occasional gleam of spider eyes reflecting back at me. I tossed the bag into the dumpster and started back. As I passed a nearby, empty campsite, something caught my eye. At the edge of the site, where the trees began, I noticed a pale, tall figure. My first thought was that it might be a person from one of the other groups collecting kindling, but the figure didn't move. I froze, staring, trying to make sense of it. My flashlight barely reached that far, but the figure stood out against the darkness. A dull, grayish-white, smooth and narrow. I told myself it had to be a birch tree, but its shape seemed off. It was too thin, too tall, and leaned slightly, almost as though it was watching me. I shook off the uneasy feeling and hurried back to our site. When I returned, the fire had burned down to glowing embers, and Clara and Jason were already getting ready for bed. I decided not to mention what I'd seen. It felt silly to bring it up. It was probably just a tree. The night was cold, and I quickly fell asleep in my sleeping bag. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with the pressing need to pee. The freezing air inside the tent made me hesitate, but nature was insistent. I grabbed my headlamp, slipped on my boots, and quietly unzipped the tent so as not to wake Clara. Outside, the campground was utterly dark. The fire had gone out completely, and the only light came from my headlamp. As I stepped away from the tent, something strange caught my attention. Scattered across the ground around our campsite and stretching into the woods were tiny glowing spots. At first, I thought they might be fireflies, but when I crouched down, I realized they were like tiny embers, small, glowing bits of coal. They weren't hot. I nudged one with my boot, and it didn't leave a mark. I stood there, baffled, staring at the glowing spots. Clara emerged from the tent a moment later, also needing to pee. She froze when she saw the glowing coals, her headlamp casting long shadows across them. We exchanged uneasy glances but didn't say a word. We finished quickly and zipped ourselves back into the tent. I lay awake for hours, haunted by the pale figure and the glowing embers. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me and I fell asleep. The next morning, over instant oatmeal and coffee, I told Clara and Jason about the figure I'd seen near the other campsite. They listened intently, their faces growing serious as I described it. Clara brought up the embers, but Jason, ever the skeptic, shrugged it all off as coincidence or some strange natural phenomenon. Curiosity got the better of us, and after breakfast, we walked to the empty campsite where I'd seen the figure. The spot was unremarkable. A fire pit, a picnic table, and a clearing surrounded by trees. But when we looked closely at the area where I'd seen the pale shape, there was no birch tree. All the trees were dark, rough-barked pines and maples. A chill ran down my spine. We spent the rest of the day hiking, trying to enjoy the trip, but the odd occurrences lingered in my thoughts. That night, we kept the fire burning longer, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Weeks later, back home, Clara and I talked about the trip. Jason had sent us a link to a blog about regional folklore, and that's when we came across stories of forest wraiths. According to the legends, they were pale, tall figures said to lurk in the woods, shy yet unsettlingly human-like. The descriptions matched what I'd seen, but the glowing embers remained a mystery. Even now, I can't explain what happened. Part of me wants to return to that campsite to prove it was all in my imagination. But another part of me, the part that still feels a chill when I think of the figure, tells me to stay away. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Camping trips had always been a cherished family tradition. In the summer of 1998, when I was 12 years old, my parents, my younger sister Lily, and I decided to spend a week at a secluded campground in the Scottish Highlands. It was the kind of place where the air felt crisp and the nights were quiet except for the soft rustling of trees and the occasional call of a distant bird. Our campsite was a vast clearing surrounded by gently rolling hills, with a handful of other families camping far enough away that it felt like we had the whole area to ourselves. We pitched a large, sturdy tent that had separate sleeping sections on each side and a spacious central area. Lily and I shared one section, my parents stayed in the other, and the third was reserved for supplies and extra gear. The tent felt like a little fortress in the middle of the wilderness. The first few days were idyllic. We spent our time hiking, cooking simple meals over a small portable stove, and gathering around a campfire in the evenings. Lily and I played tag in the fields and gazed at the seemingly endless night sky. It was a peaceful escape from the usual busyness of life. But on the fourth night, things took a strange turn. I remember it vividly because the air felt unusually heavy, almost stifling, and the sky was covered in thick, dark clouds. The familiar sounds of the outdoors seemed muted, almost like the world was holding its breath. I assumed a storm was on its way. After dinner, we retreated to our tent. The gentle patter of light rain on the canvas soon lulled me to sleep. But in the middle of the night, I woke to a sound that made my heart race. A deep, guttural cry that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, and for a moment, I thought it might just be the wind. Then, I felt the ground tremble slightly beneath me, like something large was moving nearby. Lily stirred beside me, but I stayed silent, not wanting to alarm her if it turned out to be nothing. I lay still, straining to listen, when the sound came again, louder this time, followed by a sudden, sharp thud that shook the earth harder. Before I could make sense of what was happening, the entire tent quivered violently, as if something enormous had collided with it. I heard my parents stirring in their section, and Lily bolted upright beside me, wide-eyed and scared. The next moment was pure chaos. The framework of the tent groaned under pressure, and I could hear the fabric stretching to its limits. Then, to my horror, Lily's section began to collapse. The walls caved inward abruptly, and the structure buckled as though crushed by some invisible force. Lily screamed and scrambled toward the central space, but the collapsed fabric blocked her path. My heart pounded as I scrambled to help her. My parents were already unzipping their section, shouting for us to get out. Somehow, I managed to pull Lily free, and we stumbled into the center of the tent together. The air was thick with the smell of damp soil and something else, musky, animal-like. We stood there, shaking, staring at the wreckage of Lily's section. It was almost completely flattened, with metal poles bent at unnatural angles. The thought of how close she had come to being seriously hurt, or worse, made my stomach churn. We didn't have much time to think before a voice boomed across the campground. It was the site manager, shouting for everyone to stay in their tents. His tone was urgent, almost panicked, which only heightened our fear. We huddled together as the strange cries and heavy thuds continued outside. The ground shook intermittently, and it felt like the entire tent could collapse at any moment. Eventually, the noises faded into an eerie silence that seemed even more unsettling. When we finally ventured out at dawn, The scene was surreal. The campsite looked like a disaster zone. Several tents were destroyed, their frames twisted and fabric torn. Belongings were scattered across the field. Near the edge of the campground, we saw the culprits, a large bull and its calf. Their massive silhouettes stood out against the soft morning light. The calf was making the strange, bellowing cry we'd heard, while the bull pawed at the ground, clearly agitated. Apparently, the pair had wandered in from a nearby farm after breaking through a fence. In their panic, they had trampled through the campsite, and the bull had crushed Lily's section of the tent. The thought of how close she had come to being hurt made my legs feel weak. The site manager and a few campers managed to guide the animals back to their field, and by morning, the chaos had subsided. Though Lily was shaken, she was unharmed. My parents decided we should pack up and leave. None of us felt comfortable staying after what had happened. As we drove away, I couldn't stop replaying the events in my mind. If Lily had been lying down, or if the bull had stepped just slightly differently, the outcome could have been devastating. The sight of the crushed tent stayed with me, a haunting reminder of how fragile safety can be. Even now, years later, I can still hear the calves' eerie cries and see the ruined campsite in my mind. Camping trips were never the same after that. The wilderness, once a place of solace, now felt unpredictable and untamed, a sobering reminder of nature's raw power.